Single parent situation, both ways actually. So my mom and dad separated when I was very young. When I was 3 years old, I was born in Southeast DC, Anacostia. So when I was 3 years old, my mom and dad separated. My dad went on and stayed in DC. My mom took me as a 3-year-old and we moved to Maryland. And then sort of things got rough for us, for my mom and I. And my mom, I had family in DC. My grandparents were in DC. We had other family there. But her roots were North Carolina, and things just became difficult in the DC area. And so she said, Rahmaan, I'm moving back, going back to North Carolina. It was always the case that I would spend, time with my dad and time with my mom. I would spend a lot of the time in the summer with my dad, and the weekends and stuff. He would pick me up and I would go to his house, and I would come back and I went to school and live with my mom, primarily. But when I was 10 years old, my mom decided that she was gonna go back to North Carolina to live. But she, instead of just sort of forcefully dragging me back to North Carolina with her, she gave me a choice. She said, you can move with your dad to DC or you can stay here. So I made the decision to stay with my dad in DC, and she transitioned to North Carolina. So I lived with my dad from 10 years old on. So my dad was very, we had a very, very tight relationship, and because it was a single parent situation, we were especially close. He was all I had, at least up here. My mom and I remained very close and communicated often, but she was also 350 miles away. So it was my father and I. Now, just to give you some additional background, my father was a lawyer. He was an attorney. Graduated from the from Georgetown Law School. Went to undergrad UDC. But his background was pretty unique and interesting. He was a drug addict and an alcoholic. Did a 6-year bid in the penitentiary in Kentucky for a myriad of things. Ultimately, it was my grandmother who sort of basically got him arrested, so to speak. My grandmother thought that the path for my father was going to be one of two things, either jail or death, and so she chose jail. So she basically had him set up to go to prison. Dad went to prison for several years, got out in 1974. In 1975, met my mom. They had me. 1974, met my mom. I was born in 1975. I was still using up until November of 1975. I was born in April of that year, but completely turned his life around. Went back to school, got a law degree, and was really, really, really just someone I really looked up to. Just knowing his story from a very young age of someone who was just, on the streets, doing heroin, running guns, like you name it, all of the above, he did it. And served out his time for it and came out, turned his life around completely, completed undergrad, went to law school, worked 2 jobs and went to law school at the same time. Did what he had to do to put my brother and I through school. Thankfully, put me into the Episcopal High School, which sort of gave me a structure that I didn't have in the public school system in Washington, DC. Again, as I mentioned to you before, Episcopal High School required you to play sports every season. It wasn't the case that you could just be a student. You had to be a student athlete at my boarding school. And so I thought I was a basketball player, but the athletic director and head coach said, you have a frame for football. I said, all right, so I'll do football, basketball, and track. So anyway, my dad just broke his neck, did everything he had to do to put me in Episcopal High School, and that was sort of a platform to sort of have Richmond take notice of me, and ultimately I got a scholarship to go to the University of Richmond. So my dad and I were, super, super close. I looked up to him, even to this day, thinking back on sort of his experience and what he did and turning his life around and sort of the sacrifices he made for my brother and I. It just makes me emotional just thinking about it. So, but, it's 1995 or 1996, he had become an avid runner and was having some issue with his foot. And this issue required him to have surgery on his foot. But just in running tests, the doctors determined that there was some issue with his blood and the inability specifically to not clot. That led to a series of other tests. They discovered he had liver disease. So he ultimately had to get a transplant. Got a transplant. Transplant took initially, but his body maybe 8 or 9 months later, started to reject that foreign liver. You know, when you have a transplant, you have to take anti-rejection medication because the body doesn't recognize the DNA structure of that thing. There's something about how it's coded that's different than the coding of the liver that you're born with. So the long and short of it is his body rejected that. He's on the list again for a second transplant. He's very, very sick. In the entirety of my junior year, he's in and out of the hospital, and it wore on me. And Coach Hanson identified at spring ball of 1997, you know, so call it April, you know, March, April, May of 97, he identified it, that something was off with me. And I wasn't having a great spring ball after having a pretty solid junior year. So now this is after my junior season. This is, you know, the spring in front of what would be my senior and last season at the University of Richmond. And Coach Reid, Coach Hanson, and a few other members of the staff had sort of seen that something was off with me. And, you know, he finally learned or heard, and I don't remember exactly how, that my dad had been sick. He's like, man, you should have spoken to us, man. We care about you. Like, forget football, man. Like, you should have told us you had an issue, that you were, you know, that your dad was sick and that you were struggling with this. And I was like, you know, I'm really, really sorry. Just sort of tried to you know, go on with life. And sometimes, you know, for me, not talking about it and not thinking about it, you know, at the time was better for me. So I just sort of went on and tried to carry on and, you know, do the best that I can do, both as a student, as an athlete, and not think about it. So I didn't mention it to, frankly, anybody, my friends, the staff, anybody. But Coach Hanson somehow found out, and he said, dude, I'm really bummed out that you didn't tell me. I wish you would have told me. Like, you know, we care about you. You know, you've been with the program now for 4 years. Like, we're family. You know, we care about you as a man and as an individual first. And so played out the senior season. Unfortunately got hurt in the James Madison game. Dislocated all 10 bones in my wrist and missed the second half of my senior season. So things didn't end at Richmond for Reid the way I would have hoped they would have ended. But I still, thankfully, I think had enough film to where some, you know, professional organizations had taken notice. So kind of piggybacked on Sean Barber's. So Sean Barber at the time was a pretty highly regarded collegiate linebacker, and we had a lot of workouts at UR, and thankfully I was able to piggyback on some of those workouts. And again, I was still 6'4", 260 at the time, and I was, you know, putting up decent 40 times, and so that was enough to get me not drafted, but into camp via rookie Plan B free agency. But the January of 1998, my father passed away. And I'll tell you, he passed away on January 8th. No exaggeration. The night of January 9th, Coach Reid, Coach Cullen, Coach Hanson, and Coach Leonard drove up to the DC area and stayed with me for a night just to sort of, you know, express their condolences and regards, and just sort of like, you know, just be with me to sort of talk things through. And to me, that was, you know, despite all the great memories I had throughout the 4.5 years of being a student athlete at the University of Richmond, at this point in time, it's January of 98, I'm done, because I was a redshirt. So season ends in November, I'm off campus, I'm done. I would say that that's probably the thing that spoke out to me, or I would say that's probably the thing that was most impactful to me when I think back on the experience, because it was really just a reflection of who these coaches were as men and individuals. And if there was no greater display of sort of them caring about the individual and sort of the totality of the human being than that, you know. It wasn't just about Rahmaan Streater, the football player, frankly being done at this point in time with UR football. They were like, listen, this is a guy who's special to our program. I think they felt like I contributed a lot to the program over the course of the 4.5 years. And again, it was viewed as family. Coach Hanson recruited me. I was under Coach Reid's watch for the majority of my tenure there. And you know, for those guys to get in a car right away next day and drive up, you know, that spoke volumes, you know, and forever I'll remember that. You know, I'll remember that. that experience and remember them sort of like, just, you know, just being so down at the time, and just like, it was so uplifting to me just to sort of have these guys knock on the door and show up. I can't even describe the feeling, and I can't even describe to you sort of how that forever will sort of, you know, be one of the sort of more memorable things for me. And for that reason, those guys will always sort of have a special place in sort of my heart and mind.